This day is given to us beyond anything we could create or earn. Whether deserved or undeserved, this day comes to us as a gift from the universe, a gift from God, a gift from life itself. So come and let us worship with gratitude for this and for so many gifts, with humility for our shortcomings, resilience to face the challenges ahead, and let us worship with hope that we will continue to transform our lives as we transform our world.
Mother Spirit, Father Spirit, where are you? In the sky song, in the forest sounds your cry. What to give you, what to call you, what am I? Many drops are in the ocean deep and wide. Sunlight bounces off the ripples to the sky. What to give you, what to call you, who am I am empty, time flies from me, what is time? Dreams eternal, fears infernal haunt my heart. What to give you, what to call you, oh my God. Mother Spirit, Father Spirit, take our hearts. Take our breath and let our voices sing our part. Take our hands and let us work to shape our art.
And so welcome to the Unitarian Church of Baton Rouge. My name is Nathan. I'm one of your ministers. I'm pleased to welcome you today. A few things you should know. First, if you are a visitor, whatever that looks like in these times, we're glad you're with us. Please, please, please make sure you get on our email list. That's how you can find out about everything that's going on. We only have a reopening announcement, which I'll give you in a second, and then also a what's coming up in this next week. So first, the next week stuff. So right now, if you're watching this live, you could come right on over here for middle hour. It's actually supposed to be really pretty. Cold, but like not miserable cold like last week. So you can come over, sit down, talk with other church members, make some art, whatever you would like to do. And then we're having our outside service at 11:30, so you could double dip if you want, if you're watching this. Then on Tuesday at 7 o'clock is a town hall to go over bylaw changes and to go over the proposed budget. For next Sunday, between the two services on Zoom only, we are going to have our congregational meeting. We need you there. We need a quorum to be able to vote on the budget. So without that, we have to continue to wait until we get a quorum and have a budget go. So anyway, those are the things. The other thing for you to know is as soon as our cases are below 25 per 100,000, we will worship inside again. Streaming will still be exactly the same. We will worship inside, but we will not sing until we get below 10. Does that make sense? 25, 10. To fill you in on where we are, New Orleans has been about a week ahead of us in getting the surge and ending it. So on the 10th, they were at their highest at 340 cases per 100,000. Today, 2 weeks later, they are at 128 per 100,000. So is that half? That's more than half drop off. We peaked at 381 on the 15th, and 1 week later, we're at 216. I don't know when they're going to plummet. They may sort of bottom out right around 25, and we're going to have to figure out what on earth to do, but they're coming down, so get ready to worship in person inside soon. You can still worship in person outside. We finally gambled and got the weather right. Anyway, glad you're with us today. It's a good day to be in church together.
it's striking to me how people who have an idea about God that's very different from mine still can find some incredible comfort because of it. For our lesson today, I wanted to tell a story about somebody for whom that was true and how it impacted one of my favorite hymns that's in our hymnal, and we're going to get a chance to sing that hymn together right after the lesson. But the man I'm thinking of lived about 200 years ago. His name was Henry Francis Lyte, and he became a minister as a young person in the Church of England. He hadn't really trained as much for ministry as some people, so he didn't fully know what he was doing, according to one of his biographers, when he first started in his ministry. But he soon found himself sitting at the bedside of someone who was a friend of his, another minister, much older actually, who was dying, who was very sick. And they were talking about their religious views, and in their talk about the Bible and other things, they came to have a much deeper understanding of what it was they believed. And Henry Francis Lyte in particular really sort of changed his views, changed the way that he preached in a way that wouldn't exactly meet my needs, because his style became a lot more and his theology became a lot more traditional and conservative. And he started talking about God in very personal and emotional ways. That's kind of different than some of us, certainly different than me. But it was notable that this came out of a conversation with somebody who was struggling, who was suffering, who was sick. Because Henry Francis Lyte was actually sick for much of his life. He had problems with his lungs for many years. And eventually they turned to tuberculosis, a disease of the lungs that made it difficult for him to live his day-to-day life and made it difficult for him to preach. So when he was in his early 50s, he finally realized he had to retire early from his ministry. He preached his last sermon. And then later that day, as he was preparing to leave, he lived in England, he was preparing to leave for Italy, where the warmer air would be, he thought, better for his lungs. He came out of his study that afternoon after his last sermon with the text of a hymn. And he revised it while he was on the ship that was sailing to Italy and mailed that off to his wife. But he never made it to Italy. The ship stopped in the south of France, on the south shore of France, and in a hotel room in the city of Nice in France. That's where Henry Francis Lyte died, which sounds like a sad story, and it certainly was sad for his family, but apparently not for him. There was another minister who was there when he died who said that Henry's last words were, "Peace, joy." He died comforted. He was feeling positive at the end of his life. And it seems that hymn that gave him some comfort helped that happen. The hymn is called "Abide With Me." And it's one of the more traditional sounding hymns in our hymnal. It's in the hymnals of many other churches too. And there's a line in there that I always notice because it's different from what I believe, but it comforted him. The line says, "Change and decay in all around I see, O thou who changest not, abide with me." He was talking about God not changing. And that's different from how I see God. I think of God as responding to us and changing with us, being open to being changed by us and by what's happening in the world. And for me, that's a comforting thought. But for him, in part because he was a person who struggled with his health for many years, his health changed and deteriorated over the years. he found comfort in a God that didn't change. And it reminds me that even when we have our different views, we can see how something that somebody else believes that's different from me can still be very helpful for them. But why don't we hear and, if you will, sing that together now as we play the hymn.
Today we have a number of cards that we're sending out. Soon we're going to figure out how to have all of you sign cards again, but we're just not there yet. So we are thinking of Vicki Smith as she recovers from a planned surgery. Also, if you would place 3 stones separately. First is Rachel Stevens and Case Duckworth are grieving a loss that we can talk about later. Also, place one for Rick Webb's mother, Ruth Almiller Webb. She died this week. And also for church member who's been in hospice for a while, Trudy Blanchard, died after a long illness. So we're thinking of those, these families and so much more. So because we cannot be in person now, but we could at 11:30, I will place stones in your absence as you type them into the chat or do whatever it is, place them into your chalice at home. I now invite you to virtually come forward as we place stones. And would you say with me, with hope to make this a better world, we light this flame. Its light is a symbol of the power of love.
From all that will below the skies, let songs of hope and faith arise. Let peace, goodwill on earth be sung, through every land by every tongue.
It was the darkest night of Martin Luther King's life to that point. He was still a young man, having just turned 27. It was less than 2 months before that Rosa Parks' arrest had launched King's work in the freedom struggle. King and other organizers had thought the Montgomery bus boycott would only last a few days. White segregationists probably thought the same. And when they all stood their ground and the boycott endured, things got ugly for the King family. Death threats reached a fever pitch. 30 to 40 threatening phone calls a day reached the parsonage, the home where they lived. That night, in late January of 1956, it was a Friday night, and a night that Martin could not sleep. He had attended an intense late meeting with other boycott organizers and did not get home until after midnight. He paced restlessly through the house while his spouse Coretta and their baby daughter Yolanda slept soundly. Then the phone rang again. It was an anonymous death threat again. It was no different from hundreds of other calls like it that he had received, but like that proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, this call was the one that pushed Martin Luther King over the edge. He felt alone, felt unable to reach out to others for help, unable to reach out to Coretta, to his father in Atlanta, to other boycott leaders because of the late hour. So he turned to the only source of strength and comfort he could imagine, he could conceive. He opened his mouth, and out loud, he began to pray. Not just recite some memorized devotional words, but have a conversation with God. He said, I am here taking a stand for what I believe is right, but now I am afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I cannot face it alone. Now, there's something about Martin Luther King Jr. that may not be obvious, but it bears mention. Now, King was, of course, the minister of a Baptist church in Alabama. But before that night, it was fairly out of character for him to make so personal of a prayer by himself. And in a few moments later in the sermon, I'll unpack why that was the case. First, though, it's also worth noting that we Unitarian Universalists are open to many views of God, which include, but are not limited to, the divinity that unfolds within humanity. And that's a particular way of saying it, inspired by a particular Unitarian leader from some decades ago, Reverend Waitstill Sharp. He was one of the founders of the Unitarian Service Committee, and he once found himself in the late 1930s in Europe, helping to lead a group of anti-Nazi refugees across enemy lines to freedom. One of these refugees, a German Jewish author, Leon Feuchtwanger, asked why he was doing this harrowing and dangerous work. Reverend Sharp replied, I believe that the will of God is to be interpreted by the liberty of the human spirit. The will of God is to be interpreted by the liberty of the human spirit. Now, that may sound like an abstract, if noble, religious aphorism, but living out that ideal moved Waitstill Sharp to leave his family, leave his country, and his very safety, to smuggle Jewish dissidents through Nazi Germany to their freedom. This connection between God and freedom is real for us Unitarian Universalists, but whatever role God plays in our own understanding of life and the world, we take seriously that other views of God also influence people in our lives. I'm less interested in arguing for or against a particular theology, even though I have my own views. Rather, I hope to understand how a person's theology impacts and reflects their values. And, as with the good Reverend Henry Francis Light that I described earlier, how does their theology offer comfort in times of challenge and struggle? And this is what we'll explore after this reading that offers some insight into Martin Luther King's theology.
He writes, I have been greatly influenced by liberal theology, maintaining a healthy respect for reason and a strong belief in the immanence as well as the transcendence of God. Expressing creative genius throughout the universe, which God is ever creating and always sustaining, as well as through the essential goodness of the world and human life. It is not that God is above us, to which the liberal objects, but to being asked to affirm that God is with us only in a tiny segment of experience. The liberal also finds God in the beauty of the world, in the unpremeditated goodness of people, and in the moral order of reality.
And that is why it was rare for Martin Luther King Jr. to pray in such a personal way, because at that point in his life, King's theology was too liberal to place much value in talking to God so intimately. And indeed, while Martin was studying for his doctorate in Boston University in the early 1950s, around the time he wrote those words in one of his student essays, he and Coretta Scott King frequently visited worship services at Arlington Street Church, one of the Unitarian churches in Boston. In many ways, they preferred Arlington Street Church to the more theologically conservative churches of their childhoods. But what does this mean? What does liberal theology mean? Well, you heard King's description in the reading from an essay about the views of a famous critic of liberal theology, Karl Barth. More than a century earlier, it was described this way by the great Unitarian minister, William Ellery Channing. We approach the Creator whenever we invigorate the understanding by honestly and resolutely seeking truth. Whenever we invigorate the conscience by following it, or encounter peril or scorn with moral courage. Whenever we receive a blessing gratefully, perform a disinterested deed, whenever we lift up the heart in true adoration, think, speak, or act with moral energy, then the divinity is growing within us. God becomes real to us in proportion as the divine is unfolded within us. So again, this connection between God and human freedom, it is real for us UUs, and that's why our liberal approach to theology, even as it's transforming in recent years to an even more liberationist approach, it's still inspired by that liberal tendency towards views of God that are less personal. Because, I think, we accept that free will is one of the most divine gifts we humans have been granted. We constantly strive for whatever understanding of divinity we find best affirms human liberty. That can be the divinity within humanity that was espoused by Channing and by Waitstill Sharp. Or it can be views like naturalistic theism, the idea of an impersonal divinity that's closely connected with nature. Or agnosticism, deism, non-theism. King did the same as a young theology student. His doctoral dissertation, in fact, compared the views of God developed by two liberal theologians, both still living at the time, Paul Tillich, the famous existentialist theologian, and Henry Nelson Wyman, who was a Unitarian himself. Neither Wyman nor Tillich defined God with anything like personal characteristics, and neither did the young Dr. King, whose early theology was so influenced by both of them. Still, all of their perspectives on divinity affirmed that combination of human freedom and human dignity for which King would advocate throughout his ministry. So, how do we engage with differing views of God with more personal ones? Do we just count them as wrong, or is there something to learn? And that is what we'll explore next.
Evening breeze, spirit song, sing to me when the day is done. Morning breeze, sing to me with the heartbeat of the sea. Evening breeze, spirit song, sing to me when the day is done. Evening breeze, spirit song, sing to me when the day is done. With the morning breeze sings to me with the heartbeat of the sea. Evening breeze, spirit song, sing to me when the day is done. Morning breeze, sing to me with the heartbeat of the sea. Evening breeze, spirit song, sing to me when the day is done. Morning breeze, sing to me with the heartbeat of the sea. Evening breeze, spirit song, sing to me when the day is done. Morning breeze, sing to me with the heartbeat of the
Would you join me in a moment of prayer and reflection? That God of so many names and unnamed at all, be with us on this morning. Today we think of all those who are just running out of energy, looking for things to be hopeful for, looking for things to look forward to. Thinking of all those who are feeling left behind by loved ones, by justice, by this world. Help us to know that no one is left behind, that we are all held in love and in care. Help us to be beacons of love and justice and kindness. Amen.
If, when you are honestly wanting to, you can find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you are probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. To one who feels they are an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as they are means disaster, especially if they are an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. About half our original fellowship were of exactly that type. Much to our relief, we have discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient.
At their best, I've long thought that 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous can be master workshops in theological diversity. Sure, some groups express pretty traditional views of God because that's how the members of that particular group understand God. But at their core, the 12 steps developed by AA refuse to assume a particular understanding of God because they found out the hard way that no one view of God would help them maintain a lasting sobriety. Our own conception, they said, however inadequate, was sufficient. My first year of ministry, serving as a chaplain in a psychiatric and chemical dependency facility, I saw firsthand, more directly than ever before, how much good some people gained in their lives from theologies that were far more traditional, far more personalizing of God than mine were. Some people needed a personal God to guide them in their sobriety. Others needed a more liberal, less personal God to focus their 12-step work on. Some need a God who changest not, and others need God to change and respond with them. As chaplain to those who had just hit bottom and were starting or restarting the hard road to sobriety, I learned quickly to stop trying to impose my own views of God on them and instead help them unpack how the God they knew could help them. And even with my liberal theology, I soon came to see that while many people I had known used their conservative views of God as justification for their own prejudices, others found deep comfort and motivation to lead healthier lives from such a God. So, let's return to that kitchen table in King's parsonage that late Friday night. And you can see why it was unusual for the young, theologically liberal king to just start talking to God as if God was sitting across the table. But when Martin spoke that prayer, something far more surprising happened, something that forever transformed Dr. King's faith. God answered him. He said, "At that moment," describing the event later, "I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced God before. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, 'Stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever.' Almost at once, my fears began to go, my uncertainty disappeared. I was ready to face anything." Well, however metaphorical or literal it was, King's experience that night changed him. He certainly experienced divinity respond to him far more directly than Channing had described over a century earlier. King experienced this answer in a way that his liberal views on God had not prepared him for. And in that moment, his God became personal. In a few moments, I'll conclude by unpacking what this may mean for us.
So we've come to the offering. So remember, this whole month we're sharing with Dialogues on Race, which is a phenomenal organization. They have been doing racial understanding work in this city. I don't know the math, but for more than 20 years, maybe 30 years or even more. It is a remarkable organization. And this church has been instrumental in providing, we incubated it at the start, providing facilitators. A good number of members of this church have been through it. I could think of 11 other really good organizations to give to, but in January, this is the organization we're giving to. And this church is not great about giving online. And it's not fair to ask the 10 to 20 people who braved the weather at 11:30 to do all of the offering. So if you could give to this organization, I mean, we're going to split it, so half to us and half to the organization. That would be phenomenal. So I now ask you to give either through text or mail in a check or go on the website to the /give. I think Kathy's going to type that into the chat. But whatever way you want to give, please give generously, as this morning's offering is now given and received.
Now, I, like many theological liberals, have never actually been one to conceive of God as a supreme person. But King's religious experience and his renewed view of God as personal, that's pretty hard for me to dismiss or just set aside as a difference, because he shares my theological perspective in many ways, even as there are differences. I'm finding instead that to really come to terms with somebody else's view of God, I need to look at the consequences for how we live our lives, how others live their lives in accordance with them. Jesus said, "By their fruits you shall know them." Well, for Waitstill and Martha Sharp, the fruits of their understanding of God were their incredible work to achieve freedom for those so oppressed and persecuted by the Nazis. For Henry Francis Lyte, his traditionally unchanging God comforted him in the final declining weeks of his life. And in all of the hymns today, we're hearing different perspectives on the divine articulated. Even a sanctuary with its implication of divinity found in collective humanity, each made holy, loved right through. Or Abide with Me, with its unchanging view of God, or even an Evening Breeze, which, though it doesn't speak directly to God, describes nature in terms that can easily be seen as divine. Each of these can inspire different people. And then I think of Martin Luther King again and wonder, what were the consequences, the fruits, if you will, for King's personal God, for this new metaphor or understanding based on his new experience? Well, it was described by Catholic peace activist Father John Dean, writing about how King's newly personalized relationship with God quickly came to have dramatic consequences on his life. 3 days later, Father John Dean wrote, a bomb blasted his house, and his family escaped harms by a hair's breadth. Strangely enough, King later wrote, I accepted word of the bombing calmly. My religious experience a few nights before had given me the strength to face it. News of the bombing drew a crowd. A vengeful mob of King's supporters formed within the hour. King mounted the broken porch and raised his hands and spoke. We must meet hate with love. Remember, if I am stopped, this movement will not stop because God is with this movement. Go home with this glorious faith and radiant assurance. And thus the mob, Father John Dean wrote, dissipated, their mood disarmed, and their ears ringing with the message of nonviolence. King had a spiritual experience at that kitchen table that night, and the new perspective on God he developed from it changed his life for the better. It gave him strength to face the most overwhelming of experiences with a grace and an inner peace that few could have matched on that burned-out porch of the parsonage. It recommitted him to the goals of nonviolence and the leadership of the boycott, and it kept him from feeling alone. So, I put the same challenge to us. Are the fruits of our theologies made manifest in our lives? If your theism is naturalistic, does your view of God help you to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature? If you're an agnostic, can you lift up the importance of critical thought while you're remaining open to new ideas? If you're a humanist, do you affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, not just in your beliefs, but in your actions as well? For those who are seeking a new understanding of divinity, a new way to view God, I'm not here to tell you what you must believe about the existence or the characteristics or the power of God. But I commend to each of us this practice of exploring new and different perspectives of that which is holy. For these theological perspectives, these understandings of God, free us to explore the great mysteries of divinity anew and find new treasures in the exploration, especially when fresh experiences challenge our once comfortable worldviews. But even when we would explore what we may have missed from our otherwise useful theologies, sometimes, like Martin Luther King Jr., we find resources, strength, peace, grace that once had eluded our awareness. Even as we affirm the importance of our reason, so too can we lift up our wonderful imaginations as tools for the life of the mind and spirit that enrich our time in this world and bring us more fully into right relations with all that we encounter. Don't close yourself off to the metaphors that present themselves to you. You never know what treasures await. So may it be for us all. Amen. And so, as we go forth from this sacred time, from the many sacred places where we have gathered, let us go forth knowing ourselves to be graced with the blessings of freedom and wholeness. For though our worship now ends, our service begins anew. Let us go forth and serve this hurting world in the spirit of love. Thank you for joining us for worship. Go in peace.